For centuries, the general instinct in most branches of learning was that the world and humanity were in decay. Present-day people knew less than people in the past, and that true wisdom lay in what had been known a long time. Authority was to be respected, and it usually gave all the answers which were necessary. This was particularly the case with the greatest authoritative text of all, the Christian Bible. Yet far from being intellectually disoriented by the discovery of new continents and new peoples unmentioned in the Bible, with an Antipodes or Southern Hemisphere which confounded all the opinions of the authorities, even the saints had doubts. 15th century Europe seemed to welcome the novelty of being freed from false impressions, even those in positions of traditional authority. We have witnessed a pope taking his pen to the newly enlarged globe to divide it for the Iberians, and his successor pope holding a jamboree in 1507 to celebrate what the Portuguese had achieved. Clearly, this was not a society frightened of novelty. Moreover, it could recognize parallels to the voyages across the oceans in other spheres of experience. Two recent technical innovations were recognized even during the 15th century as a radical improvement on the past. Together they revolutionized the speed of communicating information and ideas. The first was a writing material in increasingly widespread use in Europe since the 13th century. Paper manufactured from rags. Europe had not invented this process. It had been known in China for centuries. Paper was much more easily and cheaply manufactured than reed-based papyrus or animal skin bases for text, vellum or parchment, and by the end of the 14th century, Christian Europe far outstripped the Muslim world in production. In the early 15th century came the second technological revolution, printing with movable type. Again, this was a much older invention of the Chinese, but once it was introduced, Europeans rapidly took it up with enthusiasm. It was immediately clear that printing like this was much more flexible and useful as a technology of reproducing information than the existing use of carved woodblocks, which usually rather crudely reproduced mass copies of a design, but only at the size of a single page. The superiority of printing to handwritten texts, manuscripts, was less obvious, for manuscripts could present more directly the work of their author in a format which the author wanted, and they continued to be an important medium of circulating information when only a few people needed to see it, particularly in elite scholarly circles. Niccolò Machiavelli preferred manuscript to print in publicizing his controversial ideas on government to an audience of powerful people. The German Benedictine abbot Johannes Tritemius, an eccentric but influential scholar, said sniffily in 1492 that writing on parchment would last 1,000 years, while printing on paper would probably only survive for a couple of centuries. Though he had borrowed this remark from the early Christian scholar Jerome, dismissing papyrus a millennium earlier, he had a point. Although an individual text on parchment might indeed last for 1,000 years, once destroyed, it was gone forever, and it might represent the only copy of the text that it contained. Multiplication was a sure way to preserve information. For texts which required very many copies, printing was soon indispensable. Movable type text on paper, deluxe copies might still use parchment, was radically cheaper than a manuscript to produce, and once the rather laborious process of setting up the pages was completed, it was exhilaratingly easy to reproduce large print runs, on the same scale as many present-day editions. The commercial ordinances of Geneva in the 1540s assumed that in a day a skilled craftsman could produce 1,300 copies of a single sheet, for the average-sized book, 8 pages of the finished product, so editions tended to be in multiples of 700 copies, half a day's work. Larger books, which would be labor-intensive to recreate once their typeface had been broken up and reused, produced the largest runs, and they could appear in an edition of 3,000 or 4,000 copies.